Is correct. Good day, good afternoon, everyone. It is Orange and Blue today. Cecil, Lammey, Andrew Mason. We are here to talk about your Denver Broncos, and we are here to discuss, well, maybe a controversial topic, Mace, because before we jump into the grades that are out there, I may or may not be posting some of my grades later on. Denversports.com, everybody. But the ever-popular conversation of can you grade a draft right after a draft? And it seems like everyone has different opinions, Mace. So let's chop it up on that before we get into the actual grades that are floating around about the Denver Broncos. Some very good, some not so very good.
Yeah, I think the grades after a draft are useless. I don't
really.
Yes,
100%. Wow, I am 100%. Totally opposite. Let's do this. Let's do this.
100%. I mean, perhaps you can grade the process that leads to it, and I think, for example, if you are looking at the trade up for Riley Moss and what the Broncos gave up, I think it'd be fair to dock them for that because the Broncos made that trade under what I think is the incorrect notion of valuing this year's draft capital ahead of next year's draft capital. The Broncos took advantage of that last year with the Colts. I think they got fleeced, but not to the same degree the Colts were last year, but I think they got a little bit fleeced in the deal this year. So that you can grade, but the quality of the picks and the players, I'm sorry. I just, I saw a C grade, for example, given to the Broncos draft years ago when they picked Steve Atwater. And one of the reasons why they got a middling grade is, you picked Steve Atwater when Lewis Oliver was on the board. How many people under the age of 35 have heard of Lewis Oliver? But people know Steve Atwater because one's a Hall of Famer and one is forgotten. So it's stuff like that where I think draft grades immediately after the draft are useless. Happy to do a grade 3 years down the line, but after the draft, 100%. I think they're terrible. Sorry.
So let me retort, because I think grading after the draft is something we all can do. Honestly, it's something that we should do. My opinion, again, Mace. But let's chop this up in a friendly manner. Take all 7th rounders. Rounds 1 through 7, take nothing but 7th round picks. Take guys that would be undrafted. Take players from small schools. You couldn't grade that draft? Like, of course you could. Like, my argument, usually against Mike Evans, not against you, brother, but usually my argument against Mike Evans is like, well, if you can't grade a draft right after it happens, then just take anybody at any time, and you can't grade it. I don't care if it's, who's the West Florida wide receiver? I can't remember his name. David Durden, right?
David Durden, yeah.
Take David Durden, number 1 overall. Well, you can't draft it. You can't grade it, so I don't know. I think you can give an early look at what the grade or expectations should be based on what they did in college, what their kind of profile is. It's not a final grade. And if we want to play semantics, that's great, because it is not a final grade. A final grade is three years from now. Final grades, yes. But right now we can grade it based on the process, what you did, who they took, and how they project.
But we don't know how these players are going to work out. We don't know what's going to happen.
I didn't say how they're going to work out. I said how they're going to project. We can project these guys. We can project Bryce Young. We can do that. We don't know how it's going to work out. A guy could tear his ACL 3 times in a row.
But ultimately, the success or failure of the draft is how the players work out, is it not? I mean, didn't the Broncos get some very good grades back in 2018 when they got Bradley Chubb and Cortland Sutton leading off that draft? That draft doesn't look quite as good in retrospect. I recall a lot of praise for the Broncos draft, and I've seen too many times where teams got high grades the day after, and then you had it fall apart within a couple of years to where I've just reached a point where I consider the entire process to be of immediate draft grading to be, with all respect, Cecil, a waste of time.
Okay. Well, it's not a final grade. And I think maybe that's where our disconnect is here, because we don't know yet how they're going to work out. We don't. But we can say, like, generally, I feel good about the Broncos picks. Is that in itself
every
not
team
a grade?
Feels good, though.
Well, No, I'm not talking about teams. I'm talking about me, baby.
Okay,
I'm talking about you. You take time with the draft. Your opinion on this draft class has a heavier weight than, Joe Blow sitting at the corner of the bar that doesn't watch any sort of film or college football or whatever. So if you can say you feel good or don't feel good or you like this, even the Riley Moss situation, which you brought up, you are grading. Now, that's a trade. That is a trade. You already talked about that. But just the general feel, yeah, you're grading it, whether you want to admit that's a grade or not.
Well, I'm grading the process, not the pick. I mean, and the other thing is, look, if Riley Moss goes out and is a great player, then it's a great then it's a great trade. I'm just grading based on what we know the value to be. That's fairly empirical based on multiple draft value charts. What each pick is worth in that. So I'm evaluating the capital, but there's just so many unknowns to the process, and it's. I think maybe you should call it a progress report, perhaps, or a projection grade.
Yes.
Because that's the other thing. I say progress report. These guys haven't even shown up for rookie minicamp yet. I mean,
can we not grade George Payton on the job he did? Like, if we're not going to grade the actual players, because we don't know how they're going to turn out. We don't know how I could get hit by a bus when I'm on my way home today. Orange and Blue Today, brought to you by Sean Ponda, minus Cecil Lammey. Like, I don't know. We don't know these things, but I mean, we can get a feel on these players and how they've been put together, where you got them. Let's say Andre Carter was an undrafted free agent. I was like promoting taking him with your first pick if he was there. I didn't even think he'd be there. And he falls to the undrafted ranks. That's probably going to be a pretty good player. Turn out, I'm not going to say Shaq Barrett wise, but like it's probably going to be a pretty good player. So we can look at what they did.
You're looking at through your perspective, right? Like, this is how I viewed these players. This is my perspective on it.
Yes.
And so that's the prism you have for this. But you and we don't have all the information, right? I mean, for all we know, teams had more information. Maybe there's something on the medicals that didn't leak out, right? So
what was it? Tyjae Spears doesn't have cartilage in one knee. Is that right? Did I hear that correctly?
That's the rumbling, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, if with Tyjae Spears, for example, I mean, we're talking him up leading into the draft. We both liked him, but we didn't have that information at a certain point. And so part of it is I just sort of reached a point where, and some of it's being around a couple of teams over the years. Some of it's just the passage of time. I just reached a point where I realized that we think we know, to quote Jim Mora, but we don't know, right? And the other thing is these teams think that most teams think they got it right, but they miss a lot of the time as well. So it's the problem with grading is I'd be grading it only on what I believe the pick should be, and I had an increasing amount of trouble with that. I thought it was I was reflecting on it years ago, and I thought it's kind of arrogant to solely base a grade on just my own perception when I don't have every ounce of information that maybe others do possess. So
true, and I get into that. And well, if you talk about arrogance, I got no problem with that, baby. And the research that you do, like, you're not a novice. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So like, you have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what's going on with these players. So do I. Again, we're not bragging. It's our job. That's what we do. So if we have an opinion on a player, whether we're right or wrong, and I admit all the time, like, I'm going to be wrong on some picks. I'm not going to do a victory lap for every Tariq Woolen because you know what? There's a ton of Paxton Lynches out there, right? And I had a first-round grade on Paxton Lynch because I never interviewed him. Had I interviewed him, I probably would have went, oh, I don't think the guy's really upstairs all that much. I'm trying to be nice, Mace. We're not supposed to be bullies. So, like, yes, I've readily admit that. Now I want to cut down on those things. I also had a first-round grade on Dak Prescott that year. So it's like, okay, we don't have all the information, but with what we do have, we can make a determination on whether we feel good or bad about what the Broncos did. And that's why these grades, I'm seeing the worst grade. It was, I believe, Sports Illustrated gave them the worst grade of any team in the NFL. They didn't do that. They weren't the worst grade. I don't think I've seen any A's or A minuses, CBS Sports or whatever. It's like, okay, so where truly is that? So people are grading them, whether we like to or not. I like to. You have stopped liking it. I'll get you back, baby. I'll get you back. But like, it's worth a conversation. I think it's a fascinating conversation, honestly.
It is. It's a fascinating conversation, and I have to admit I've made up my mind on it. Like I just was as we were talking, you mentioned Paxton Lynch, and I just quickly said, okay, let me see if I can find a draft grade for the Broncos, 2016, B plus, and it was a B plus based on primarily the Paxton Lynch selection. Now, if you go back and look at the entirety of the draft, you'd say, oh, well, they got a multi-year fullback, round 6 in Andy Janovich. They got a punter who's still around 8 years later, 7, 8 years later in Riley Dixon. And they got a safety who's been terrific for them in Justin Simmons, right? But still, if we're grading that draft, even with Simmons and those others that I mentioned, we're giving it a pretty middling grade because the first pick, the most important pick, the one for you wish you trade up, end up being a mistake that led to other mistakes that set the franchise back years. I mean, because of the failure of Paxton Lynch left the team gun shy 2 years later when Josh Allen was sitting them staring them in the face.
I think it's almost, and I'm totally off here. And honestly, I thought we agreed on this, but I guess we didn't. Which is fine. It makes for great radio, great TV. What are we streaming? TV something?
Streaming. Yeah.
I don't know. Whatever. But I think it's again fascinating because it's like when your car is worth X amount of dollars, and then later on it could be worth more or it could be worth less. Usually worth less. But I'm thinking of collector cars myself because I'm. Well, just before the show, honestly, I was looking at Shelby's. I was like, I already have one. I don't drive it. It's going to be my son's when he's ready for it. Then I will get another one. But like certain cars, as a car guy, like there's certain cars that increase in value. There's certain cars that don't. And even though at the time you buy them and they're hot and you're on a waiting list for the new hottest car, and then later on it's not worth anything. It's not worth what you had thought. So I think grading at the time, because if you were to rewind, and maybe it's back far enough when you did grade a draft. Like I would be curious, because my grade, it's probably out there, honestly. I bet I could find my grade on the Broncos draft with Paxton Lynch. It was probably around the B plus range, and probably towards the B plus range. And I think based on what they needed at the time, which was a quarterback, based on he was universally graded as a first-round player. I wasn't the only one that graded. And I'm not making excuses. I'm not, making sure that I'm safe. Like, no, tell me I had Paxton Lynch as a first-rounder. Yeah, what am I going to say? No. I spent a year on air talking about how he should start over Trevor Siemian. Point is this. What's my point? The point is, like, at that time, based on what they did, a first-round quarterback was drafted by them in the first round that Andy Reid liked, that obviously Jerry Jones liked, whatever. We know how history has changed. So I think grading today, it's not the final grade, but it is grading what you did based on your need, based on who was available, and then again, based on the rankings, sometimes consensus, sometimes not. Again, Andre Carter, it was when I would see Andre Carter in certain mocks or people talking about it, like he's going to be a 7th-round pick, I was like, there's no way. How can you watch Andre Carter and see as a 7th-round pick, and he goes undrafted? So even worse than that. So and that's what's so great, Mace. And maybe this is why I love it so much and why I defend grading a draft, because it's not the final grade. But I love it because it's this puzzle that the pieces move as you go to put them on the table. And you never know the full answer. And that, to me, perhaps is the most fascinating of all.
The fact that you never know the full answer is probably why the grading process is a little bit unnecessary to begin with, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I'll bring up one more thing, and I love going back and forth with you, and obviously nothing but love. For Sports Illustrated, and I can't remember the writer. Somebody told me who the writer was. I don't know who it is. Okay, and it's not that if I know you, you're the greatest ever, and if I don't know, there's plenty of people I know in this business that aren't worth a damn. So I'm not saying it has anything to do with me, but when the writer was brought up to me, I have no idea who it is. I think I might have heard the name. Anyway, when Sports Illustrated says the Broncos had the worst draft in all of football, can you agree or disagree with that? I think you would disagree with that, and thus, in a way, you're kind of grading it. Did they have the worst draft in football? Yes or no? Did they have the Broncos? Nobody's worse than the Broncos. Yes or no? And you're going to say no. No, they didn't have the worst draft.
Yeah, but I don't know who had the worst draft. I mean, at this point, maybe the 49ers because they picked a kicker way too soon. But then it's not. We're not grading the pick. We're grading the positional value, right?
Right.
At that point.
Right.
And also, if I'll say this as well, if are you grading on a curve relative to the value of the pick? That's the other thing. If you're not grading on a curve and you're saying, okay, it's the overall quality of players, well, then the Broncos are going to come up short because they didn't pick until 63, right?
Right.
But but I think any grade is based on value. Like one thing that I did in reviewing recent Broncos drafts back in April at denversports.com was I looked at not only the positional value but also the value of what they end up getting relative to where they picked. And honestly, based on if we just do a 2-year evaluation of the 2021 draft based on where the Broncos picked, they actually got decent value. And even a 1-year evaluation on last year's draft, again, relative to where the pick was, the picks were, because they didn't go until pick 64, the Broncos actually did well on the value metric because they got a starter in round 4 in Damari Mathis, a guy who proved to be a starter 1/3 of the way into a rookie season. They got some production out of Greg Dulcich before he got hurt, and they found a steady rotational guy in Matt Henningsen in round 6.
Notice how you didn't say Nick Bonito. And I think last year is a perfect example of what we're talking about. Last year, I was like, Bonito's probably the pick. They got him. There were other tight ends that I like better than Greg Dulcich, Chigi Okonkwo being one of them, Jelani Woods another. So, like, tight end, whatever's whatever. There was, like, this cluster after Trey McBride. It's like Trey McBride and then a cluster. And I happen to like other guys, but whatever. Dulcich was right there. He went off where he was supposed to go off. Now we look at Bonito as a wasted pick. And they clearly don't like Dulcich. I don't want to say they don't like him. That sounds mean. Clearly they have other plans at tight end. So just in 1 year, we went from feeling good about their first 2 picks to, I don't even know what these guys are going to do now.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is where I don't want to let my own feeling on a player kind of on a prospect get in the way here, and that's another reason why I step back from grading because I didn't want to get caught in that trap. I didn't particularly like the Nick Bonito pick when the Broncos made it. I was lukewarm on it, in part because he wasn't asked at Oklahoma to do a lot of things that you have to do as an edge in the NFL.
Right.
That's why he lasted as an edge until pick 64, but also because right behind QB in terms of your core positions, what you target early, it's QB and then edge, right? It's either the quarterback or then the guy who is most likely to disrupt the quarterback. And because of that, when you get to pick 64 and you're taking an edge, it's almost like if you pick a quarterback in the second round, right? Because we've seen over time the success rate, basically it's like falling off a cliff when you get into round 2 at quarterback, and it's not quite to the same degree, but it's pretty substantial when you talk about edges going from round 1 to round 2 and how the success rate on that falls. And so I didn't like the pick for that reason, because I thought, okay, I think you're more likely to find a starter at another position than an edge who basically, there's a 50-50 chance he never blossoms into more than just a rotational player. And now we see a year later, and it just like at tight end, you bring in Drew Sanders, and it's possible Drew Sanders, if they give him position flexibility, Drew Sanders may take Nick Bonito's reps. That is a legit possibility right now as we head into this. And that's another theme of this draft, is that for most of the picks, it was about some form of correction for a recent draft. If Michael Ojemudia works out, you're not picking Riley Moss in round 3. If KJ Hamler stays healthy, you're not picking Marvin Mims Jr. You're not trading for Adam Troutman if you like where Greg Dulcich can go, but they see Troutman as a better fit. It's almost like this year was a repudiation of the last few years in some respects. And if the Broncos had 10 picks, I think that pattern would have continued.
Yep, would have continued right down the roster. It is Orange and Blue today, presented by Champ Honda. The debate will continue, my friend, because I think I am going to write up grades now.
Hey, you do that. I'm not
I
stopping you from doing that.
Examine what other people, because like the Sports Illustrated, they didn't have the worst pick in the NFL. Come on, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And I haven't read the full article, so I don't want to say something outrageous, but here goes. Whoever wrote that doesn't pay attention. Like you don't draft Marvin Mims and a Drew Sanders, and you call this the worst pick and the blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, enough. I'll move on. Super quick, because I want to talk about positionless football with you more, but rookie surprise. And again, a topic that we can definitely unfold many, many times over. Any sort of rookie surprise, even on the undrafted players. Because, like, okay, there's some undrafted players we've talked about that get some notice out there. Is there anyone that you think might surprise people in 2023?
Oh, man. I mean, it's a good question because look, with a 5-player draft class, you're going to end up with some undrafted players, I'd say plural, who end up making the team. Yes. I think I will tell you what, even though he doesn't have as much tread left on his tires as some others, I'd keep an eye on Jaleel McLaughlin, the running back out of Youngstown State, because skill set wise, he fits the bill of what Sean Payton wants. He's got speed. He can catch the ball. He's a willing blocker. He's compact, 5'8", 194. So I think he carries that weight really well. And then on the defensive side, I think the obvious one is Thomas Incoom out of Central Michigan, who I think you and I were both surprised we didn't see his name called on day 3. He'll probably be, I know I said this yesterday, he's probably battling with Christopher Allen for a roster spot. And again, kind of like we talked about the draft picks, I favor the player that Sean Payton brought in over the one who was on hand. And so if it comes down to Incoom and Christopher Allen for one spot, I would expect Incoom is the guy who makes the 53.
What's cool about Incoom, because some guys, and he's relentless. Okay, so a lot of his sacks are hustle plays, but he has multiple moves, Mace. He just doesn't know how to use them. If the first move gets stunted, he's just like turtle on his back, right? Like he's just like, all right. So if someone can teach him, and I'm not exactly sure if he will be able to master this skill, but if he learns how to stack moves or set up, rip into swim and power into speed, like these sorts of things, like he does have moves. He just uses one, it doesn't work, and he's like, I'll just keep hustling. Like, that works great in college, not so much in the NFL.
But you like the hustle, though, and that's another thing. I mean, if you look at the plays that he's making, he's making a lot of effort plays as well. But he's got to go that second move a little bit quicker. But I think at minimum, when he walks in, he is the equal of where Nick Bonito was walking in last year. And I'd say, wow. And I'd say Bonito, that's on balance. Bonito had more explosiveness coming in than Incoom does. Incoom is better against the run, and he'll make some hustle and pursuit plays against the run as well. And that's why on balance, I'd say where Bonito was when he walked in last year is where Incoom is when he walks in this year. To me, even though it's a room that has a lot of question marks, it's not that it isn't deep. I mean, the Broncos have a fair amount of quality edge rushers. Right. It's just that what they're missing the alphas atop of the depth chart, right? Because you're still learning about Baron Browning, and Randy Gregory can't stay healthy. They're kind of like the Seattle Kraken. Their first line didn't match up to what the Avs were, but you got to the third and fourth line, they had an advantage. Broncos have some serious depth here, but the fact that they're a little less when you get to the top line, even the second line, I think that opens things up for Incoom to push. And if he plays the run well, I think he can nudge past Nick Bonito in that. And then, because the other thing also, about this, I mean, we talk about that room. We talk about a guy like Jonathan Cooper, who's an outstanding effort and hustle guy. Of course, the problem for Jonathan Cooper is drafted by the previous regime, right? Even though he's done reasonably well when asked, there could be a numbers game shaping up at edge as well. And Incoom is, I think, probably, in my opinion, is the jewel of this undrafted class.
Perfect. Cecil, Lammey, Andrew Mason, Orange Blue today, presented by Champ Honda. I wanted to talk to you about positionless football. I was talking with our friend Sigmund Bloom this morning, and we were going down memory lane of how we've often talked about positionless football. It was honestly a theory, an advanced theory, the Big Al told me about probably 15 years ago, where he's just like, someday there's just going to be football players. Like, you're just going to get guys to make plays. And honestly, when I look at this draft, we even had a question from Detroit Mission Control in the chat room. Like, is VJ good enough and creative to take advantage of positionless players? I think VJ is almost looking forward to that, based on some of the players that did work and did not work, by the way, in Arizona. So, like, yeah, this draft, if there's one common thread, it's versatility. And I think positionless football, like, he's an ILB. Well, he's kind of a linebacker. JL Skinner, he's a safety. Yeah, he's kind of a linebacker, safety, something. He's a football player. So positionless football, I think, is another one of these fascinating post-draft conversations.
The concept isn't new, right? 40 years ago, the Broncos drafted Carl Mecklenburg,
Right.
who literally played every position in the front seven. It's one of the reasons why his Hall of Fame case is so difficult, is because he's kind of a unicorn. He's hard to classify. In my opinion, it should make his Hall of Fame case slam dunk. There really wasn't anybody like Mech back in the day. But you have Vance Joseph coming from Arizona, and he eventually figured out how to get something out of Isaiah Simmons. Of course, the Cardinals aren't picking up the fifth-year option on Simmons, but Simmons, very talented player, kind of a unicorn, and took a little bit of time for them to figure out, how this positionless player can work, but he got it done. And then Zaven Collins, they bring him in and they move him around. He actually ends up flourishing. The problem is a lot of coaches are afraid of positionless players, because what happens is if you move them around play to play, that means other players have to move around as well. So there's an adjustment for multiple players to account for that positionless one. But if you've got the talent, that's the kind of thing that you should be willing to do. Get the talented player on the field and then worry about the rest of it. Worry about making it all work. And I think that's something that stands out. And I would even say Riley Moss early on might be something of a positionless player as well, even though they're going to train him first at cornerback. I asked Moss on the media conference call, hey, you talk with the Broncos quite a bit. What do they see you as? What do you think they see you as they're drafting you? And he answered, DB. And that means getting some safety looks, getting some dime back looks, maybe even he's your guy on standby at the nickel corner if K1 Williams gets hurt, and he tends to have one injury that costs him a few games a year, right? I think you're talking basically about three defensive players coming in the draft who do not have easily defined roles and cannot be put into a box.
Some coaches don't like the word tweener, right? And
they're afraid
sometimes
of
they
tweeners.
don't work out, and sometimes players are ruined by their pro teams. I still think DeMarcus Walker could have played. Justin Hollins was one of my favorite. You and I saw him down in the orange Sunkist, right? What's in Tampa? What's the dome? No, why am I forgetting
Tropicana
the dome?
Field.
Tropicana. I knew it was the orange juice something. I was like, it's not the Orange Bowl. It's not Sunkist. Tropicana. Yeah. So you and I saw him at the Trop. I love Justin Hollins, and it was like, he's outside, he's inside, he's outside. DeMarcus Walker, it was like, stand him up, lose weight, drop down, gain weight, put your hand in the dirt. Like, so some of these players I almost feel bad for when they're positionless because the team screw them up.
Yeah. Now, the thing with DeMarcus, it's not that he was positionless. Because when he came in, you thought he was going to be right there as a 3 or 5 technique, right? And that's what he does now, and he's really good at it. He was a rotation. He had 7 sacks in a rotational role starting 6 games for Tennessee this past year. By the way, 7 sacks would have led the Broncos. He got that coming off the bench for most of the year. I believe he had a sack of Russell Wilson when the Broncos went to Tennessee as well. But everything at Florida State screamed this guy should be on the interior, taking advantage of his length and his quickness to create a mismatch in the pass rush against an opposing guard. It was all there, and whether it was Vance Joseph, John Elway, or just the whole process, asking him to lose weight and move to outside linebacker was one of the more foolish moves with a draft pick of the John Elway era, because you basically said, all right, you're taking his skill set out of play, the advantage that he has. Now, they moved him back inside, and then by the time after they moved him inside, he became a guy who became a pretty consistent, efficient pass rusher in a limited role, 8.5 sacks over 2 seasons, 2019 and 2020. So I think with him, it was less about he was positionless and more they just mismanaged him. Justin Hollins, that was a guy they didn't quite figure out, and unfortunately, it's been to the detriment. The fascinating thing on Justin Hollins, though, is that they took him. They couldn't figure out how to find the right spot for him. And then 2 years later, they take Baron Browning, who's also another inside-outside linebacker, right? It's like,
Yes.
Now Browning's working fine so far. He's a good player, but it's like, what are you guys really doing here, right? I mean, why can't, you seem to have a plan for Browning. Why didn't you have a plan for Justin Hollins? I don't know. There's so much over the last few years that has gone wrong, and that's why one of the things I like hearing from Sean Payton this past weekend is when he rhetorically asks, "What's the vision?" They go through this with every player and ask, "What's the vision? The long-term plan here? What do we see them as?" And what you got from Sean Payton was pretty clear answers, I thought, as to the vision that they have for each of these draft picks. And that's something that was decidedly muddled under the previous regimes.
I have to hit the checklist for Orange Blue Today bingo out there, but when you say Sean Payton talking about vision, I will say, Zang. That's your Wayne's World reference for the day.
Oh my gosh. I thought you were going to do like a foreigner. Like,
oh, yeah.
With that double vision.
Yeah, double vision. And that's about all I know of the song. But at least I know the chorus. Anyway, seems like, oh, by the way, not to give too much away and to tell tales. If there were any decisions made during the Vance Joseph era, they were not made by Vance Joseph. I can almost assure you of that.
Which is why I brought John Elway into the conversation, right?
Yes, the John Elway regime era. Yeah, so.
But hey, today is the 40th anniversary of John Elway being introduced as the Broncos quarterback.
Okay.
The trade. 40 years ago tonight, Dan Reeves is watching Nuggets Spurs Game 4 at McNichols Sports Arena, and he goes darting away. The press corps gets called away for a press conference at Broncos headquarters at 10:30 that night, and it was like a bomb went off on press row. I think the other side of that is it was an NBA playoff game. I think it was on ESPN, and back in Maryland, Frank Kush and Ernie Accorsi are both at their homes watching the playoff game, and they get word of the trade. And I think one of them, or no, Accorsi was watching.
I think it was Ernie,
Kush,
yeah.
Yeah, and Kush wasn't. And Accorsi calls Kush, I believe, and says, "Are you watching the NBA?" And Kush says, "No." Why? I said, I think they just traded I think our owner just traded our quarterback. And the funny thing is, I actually went back and looked at some of the newspapers from the time. The trade, there was for a moment a potential hitch, and the hitch was Chris Hinton did not want to go to Baltimore either. Like, Hinton was who'd been introduced and he'd flown out to Denver.
Fans
and all
loved
that.
him, yeah.
Yeah, loved it. Like, Chris Hinton was excited about being a Bronco. Loved the reception. He was going to be a bookend tackle. He was excited about that opportunity, and I think there was one article I was looking at today from 40 years ago where Chris Hinton was saying, "If I'd known this, I would have just signed with the Chicago Blitz of the USFL."
Chicago Blitz. There you go.
But the trade did happen 40 years ago today. And while the last few years weren't great, John Elway really did change the franchise. I mean, that it's the most important figure in Broncos history, no doubt. Yeah. And here we're going to celebrate the good, but we're also going to point out the bad the last few years. By the way, officially, John Elway's name no longer on the Broncos staff directory, not even as a consultant.
Still the king of Mile High, though.
Yeah.
And the Broncos can be back at the top in the front of everyone's attention span when it comes to the Mile High City. He's Andrew Mason. This is Orange Blue Today, presented by Shop Honda. You follow Mace on Twitter, at Mace Denver. I'm at Cecil Lammey, saying thank you. Do all the YouTube things like comment, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you never miss a vid and help us grow our YouTube channel. Watching the end of the video really helps that with the YouTube algorithm, and we appreciate you for doing just that. He's Mace, I'm C, so OBT is BFD. We appreciate you. Be safe, be kind, know that you're appreciated. Stay tuned, and as always, please stay frosty.